So each society in the world has to face that challenge. How do you create a social contract that both provides cohesion, in society and maximizes the space for individual freedom? And our point of contention here is essentially that the Nordic countries have been particularly good at finding that type of solution.
So, welcome to the Nordic Metamodern. My name is Lene Andersen, and today I am visited by Lars Trägårdh, and he is one of the authors of this very interesting Swedish book called Is the Swedish Human? Är svensken människa? Being a Dane and living right next to Sweden, we of course sometimes do raise that question. I'm going to ask Lars, who is Swedish, what is meant by that. So welcome, Lars.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Good to see you again. We have met briefly before on Zoom, actually, so this is the first time that we're going to have a longer conversation. So when I started planning this episode, I was wondering if I should call it "Is the Scandinavian Human?" because we in the Nordic countries are seen as sort of the maybe not a utopia, but an achievable utopia. One of our friends in the Global Bildung Network came up with that term. So the world looks to the Nordic countries and asks, so what is it that they're doing right? We also have a strong undercurrent of nationalism right now. And there's, of course, the love of country, which is a good thing. And then there's the nasty version, which is a national chauvinism. And we got both of them we got them both in Denmark and in Sweden. So I'm going to ask Lars about that and how we identify as Danes and Swedes and what it means to be a people actually in this day and age. But before we do that, I would like Lars to just briefly introduce himself. So please, Lars.
So I'm an historian at heart. I was trained in the US. In fact, I lived there 40 years. So a lot of my thinking about Sweden and the Nordic countries at large are comparative by nature. So I arrived in the US with about sort of young preconceptions about Sweden and the United States, and a lot of it had to do with the kind of traditional view of the Nordic countries as sort of quasi-socialist of some sort, very collectivist in its orientation. Whereas the U.S. was based on this idea of rugged individualism, and I came over time to challenge both of those ideas, and that's what resulted in this book that you mentioned before. In Swedish, it's called Är svensken människa. The book is now coming out in English, and it has a different name, The Swedish Theory of Love, with a focus on social trust on the one hand and individualism on the other hand. So I'll sort of stop there. We can get back to other questions about my trajectory if you like later.
Cool. So I had, I don't know if I had a similar experience of my first journey to the United States. I went there a Dane. My Danish sense of identity was very strong, but I did not become an American by going there. I realized that I was European. Right. So I bet that, and you were very young when you went there.
Yeah, I recognize what you were saying. I went first year. I was there as in a high school and a boarding school, and then I was mostly preoccupied just with becoming American. Right, I was fleeing Sweden. Actually, I was Sweden at that time. This is 1970. Was a very narrow-minded country. I remember I'm from Skåne, south of Sweden, so I always felt like going to Denmark as much as possible was kind of a form of freedom for me as a Swede living this very repressed, paternalist country that Sweden really was. But the second time when I go back, 2 years later, I went back to college in California, which is really where I wanted to go in the first place. For me, it was all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, really, to be quite honest. I didn't have any high ambitions intellectually or otherwise. But then, I experienced just what you were saying, like arriving at this campus in Southern California. Had a lot of foreign students because it was one of the few American universities at the time that accepted foreign students on the same basis as everybody else. So it was the same financial aid programs, same costs and all of these things. So it was actually open, right, to the global. And we were all there finding ourselves in this position of sort of realizing how much we were Europeans or Latin Americans or Africans, right? And we were sort of existentially united also in the status of being an immigrant. different. So we found a commonality there that went beyond, right, just simply, you know, I'm a Swede and you're a Dane and we are super different, right? So there was a broader sense of it, a we, that had to do with being, let's say, European or just simply a foreign student.
So one of the things that I would like to ask you about is the because I do identify also as a Scandinavian or a Nordic person, and I do sense the difference when I go to Germany, for instance, or definitely the US. So what would you say are the major similarities and or differences between the Nordics, and we're going to go to Denmark and Sweden in a moment, but the Nordics and the rest? What is it that we do that is so different?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good sort of first question, because I think you're absolutely right that there is a kind of a paradox here, right? That in some situations, right, the Nordics are very much aware of what we have in common. And then other times we're indulging in what Freud called the narcissism of minor differences, right? So, you know, the Danes and the Swedes are preoccupied, oh my God, we are so different. And, you know, those guys are crazy or bad or doing weird things. And then we are in Germany, right? Or in France or in the United States. And we suddenly find, oh my God, you know, we have much more in common than we are really different. So I think you're absolutely right that that's a question that needs to be taken very seriously. And for most people, let's say I'm going to Berkeley in about a week's time or 2 weeks' time, and they're starting a Nordic center there, right? And of course, they are not primarily concerned about these differences within the Nordic region. So let's start. You know, I think the one that, from my point of view, doing recent years, a lot of studies on social trust and also trust in institutions, we see that this is really where the Nordic countries stand out as a unit, right? And you can add to that also the Netherlands, I would have to say here. They are also quite Nordic in this perspective. So this sense that there is a stable democracy based on the rule of law, confidence in common institutions, not just in government, but, you know, all the institutions at different levels, and including not just public, but also private institutions. You know, we have confidence in our, you know, private sector as well. We have a very rich associational life, right? This stands out here in the Nordic region. So these are aspects that are sort of foundational, right? And then, of course, add to that is a little bit what I've been writing a lot about, is that there's a strong sense of a social contract that's tying the individual citizen, right, to the state, so that there is a kind of a sense of an individual freedom being at the center, even though the social contract, of course, is based on a sense of commonality among the population at large. And that might seem like a paradox, but I think it actually goes hand in hand. We'll talk more about that later, I'm sure.
So one thing, I mean, you mentioned trust, but I think the other side of that coin is responsibility. And I think the level of institutional responsibility, but also the educational system and this whole concept of bildung, dannelse, and bildung is, I mean, we're called Nordic Bildung, and then we're behind the podcast here. So bildung is very central to what we do, and it's this personal development, it's knowing where you are and where you're coming from, who you are. And we have a school system, an educational system that is very much focused on not just the transfer of knowledge, but also the taking responsibility and evolving as a person. Do you see more institutional responsibility in the Nordics than elsewhere?
Well, first of all, I want to say, just agree with you. I think that you're absolutely right that what we're dealing with here is not just simply, right, a passive citizen who, you know, has confidence in the state solving all of the problems. It is a reciprocal relationship. It's based on you know, going both ways, like a balance between rights and duties. Right? And the bildung tradition, I think, you know, from my perspective, and I think this is also how I understand your analysis, right, is based on individual responsibility, right? It comes from what we can think of as a liberal tradition, actually, you know, self-improvement, of investing in yourself, taking responsibility, and understanding that a social contract, Nordic style, right, is based on these very simple formula. Citizens, you know, that educate themselves, they work, they pay taxes, and then they earn the rights, right? So these things hang together as one package. And here schooling is very, very central. And if you look at this high age, I would say, right, of the Nordic model, stretching from somewhere in the 19th century up until, in this case of Sweden, right, maybe somewhere, in the 70s and 80s, you had that type of ethos, right, in the school system. Since then, Sweden at least has undergone a far more negative trend, right, where we've seen some real problems in school results. And this has had to do with changes in the pedagogy that used to be, if I may put it in those terms, quite traditional, right? There were facts, there were teachers, the students had to learn the facts and listen to the teachers. Now that sort of went out of the window in Sweden somewhere starting in the 70s and 80s and accelerating, and that is a huge challenge right now, to try to see if we can recapture some of the magic of that bildung tradition in Sweden. That may be a little bit better still in the other Nordic countries. We often in Sweden look not so much perhaps to Denmark and Norway, but certainly to Finland as having chosen a more traditional way with, relatively speaking, better results.
I think everybody is looking to Finland. And let's just to clarify for those who are not of Scandinavia or the Nordic countries. So Scandinavia is technically Denmark, Norway, and Finland, and it's named after the Scandi something mountains that run as the border between Sweden and Norway. We don't have any mountains in Denmark, so we're honorary Scandinavians somehow. Finland is part of the Nordic countries, but not technically in Scandinavia. But if you just talk about the Nordics, that could be Northern Germany, it could be North America, it could be, northern part of many things. So from time to time, we just include the Finns into the Scandinavian group.
I'd add, Lene, here just very quickly, sorry to interrupt you, but from a Swedish point of view, and certainly from a Finnish point of view, of course, given that Sweden and Finland were essentially part of the same state for a really, really long time, even though the language difference there, is a barrier, a different way than it is in relationship to Norway and to some extent Denmark, although the Danish is very problematic for many Swedes. Finland is sort of felt to be different. But in fact, if you look at the institutional makeup, the political culture, there are really no two countries that are more similar than Finland and Sweden. So in that sense, one might say that actually Denmark, right, is a bit more different, right? Also think about the most important cultural division, alcohol, right? Denmark belongs to the beer sector, along with Germany, Holland, and Belgium, and Britain, whereas Sweden and Norway and Finland belongs along with the Poles and the Russians with the vodka belt. So that's a real profound difference.
So now we're getting into the differences among the Nordic countries, and that's actually very interesting as well, because we do have our differences, and it's not just the narcissism of little differences. It is there are some historical reasons for the differences. And just to recap, I mean, you said Finland and Sweden, and they actually used to be under the Swedish crown in the same state, but the languages are entirely different. Swedish is you could say that Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish are really dialects of the same language. But Finnish is from a completely different root. So we can't understand any Finnish unless we actually learn it. Many Finns have been, still are, know Swedish. They used to be bilingual, a lot of people. And then there's the whole sense of I guess there's a power struggle also, and a sort of colonial feel to the relationship from some part of the Finnish side. But during the Napoleonic Wars, Russia took Finland from Sweden, and then Sweden got Norway, which used to belong to Denmark. And the Norwegians really wanted to be separate and have their own independence, and they were like, "No, you'll be Swedish now," and that was not a popular thing. I think, and that's one of the interesting things here, is that for the past 150 years after, and particularly after Finland got its independence, and they actually fought for it very heavily, and also during the Second World War, there has developed this sort of sibling rivalry among the Nordic countries, but also a sense of belonging together. And from a Danish point of view, at least, Sweden is seen sort of this older brother that we can't really do as much as Sweden can, and it has it's kind of it leaves us with a sense of inferiority. And the worst thing about it is that we constantly compare ourselves to Sweden, but Sweden doesn't compare itself to us. Sweden compares itself to the United States. So, so these are some of the differences. And you just mentioned Denmark as the place of freedom. I do get the sense, particularly from people in Stockholm, that is like, oh, we're going to the continent. We're going to Denmark. It's like you can do anything there. So could you share some of the differences that are?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, partly this is in the area of sort of cliches and, sort of stuff that, you sit in Brussels and you talk about how everybody's different from each other. So you have to be very careful in this, when you have this sort of loose talk about, cultural differences. And I think that, it is, a lot of it is in fact cliches, right? The differences are not particularly great. I mean, we often joke that, when you go to Denmark, for example, right, you find that there are actually sometimes more rules about certain things, like traffic rules seems to be harsher there than in Sweden. During the Corona pandemic, we were flabbergasted, right, in Sweden, right, to see that Denmark chose such a sort of hard lockdown approach, right? Because if you looked at, let's say, how Danes and Swedes handled the AIDS epidemic, or the cholera epidemic before that, you would have expected Denmark, to be more, worried about civil liberties and the freedoms, and Sweden to be much more draconian. And that was not the case. Now, this is not going to be a discussion about that, but I'm just pointing it to saying that there's some complexities here. But I do think, right, if you want to be serious about it, there is a sort of when I, as a student of civil society and state relations, I would say that Denmark has had a little bit less of a fixation, right, on the state than has been the case in Sweden. You've had a tradition, for example, right, of embracing a little more pluralism when it comes to schools, when it comes to the relationship between state and church. You've had, a little bit more space, right, for what we sometimes call civil society. Whereas in Sweden, we have been a little bit more in love, right, with the state. Again, I don't want to exaggerate this, right, but there's something like that there, and there is a kind of a overall cultural sense in Denmark, right? That, I remember, a couple of decades ago, you started talking about chaos pilots in Denmark, right? Dealing with modernity. And it seemed like it was a comfortable idea for a Dane, right? It was an expression of this sort of, well, it's a little bit messy, but, that's life. And let's have fun and go out and drink a beer and see if we can live with this. Whereas in Sweden, would be more a sense of panic. We have to find some order here. We can't have this kind of chaos. So, and for me, as a Skåne guy, right, from the south of Sweden, I always tended to prefer, that element of sort of freedom in Denmark, and be bothered by this very state paternalism that I often experienced in Sweden. So there's something like that, that we talk about. And again, these are often exaggerated and turn into cliches. We have to be careful with it, I think, but there's something there, perhaps.
So actually, one of the previous episodes here, the past one, was actually with Uffe Elbæk, who started the Chaos Pilots. And I think,
yeah.
So if anybody wants to learn more about the Chaos Pilots, please listen to that episode. I think you're right about the sort of looseness. One of the ways of describing the differences between Denmark and Sweden is that Sweden is Mickey Mouse and Denmark is Donald Duck. So there is this, orderly, we must think this through. And I know that from people who work in Danish and Swedish companies, that Swedes can talk about, discussing forever and ever, and everybody must be heard. And then the rumor has it that when you disagree, then you just go out and do it the way that you decided to do it. And the Danes just, start And then if we reach an agreement, people do it the way they want to do it anyway, irrespectively of the agreement on how to do things. So there's a kind of looseness. Do you see the I think there's a German influence in Denmark that is different than the French influence in Sweden.
Yeah, I think so. And I know you and I in the past have talked a little bit about sort of the role Grundtvig has played in to formulate a very stable and enduring narrative about Danishness, right? And Grundtvig, of course, was highly influenced by the German philosopher Herder, right? So this idea of the folk, right, became very, very important in this Herderian sense, right? You know, with some more ethnic overtones, right? You know, it was Danishness, right, as a sort of a matter of culture, right? Whereas in Sweden, what we see is our version, you know, of Grundtvig was the Swedish historian Erik Gustav Geijer, who is both historian and poet, in many ways quite similar in that sense to Grundtvig. And he, along with others, sort of reacted to the loss of Finland in the early 1800s by starting to reformulate, you know, a new kind of vision of Sweden, no longer as a great power, right? But, you know, as a small country, a little bit similar to what happens in Denmark, you know, after the loss, you know, Schleswig-Holstein and sort of the kind of emergence of little Denmark, right? As opposed to the more imperial Denmark that was there earlier. So there's a similarity there in Sweden and Denmark, which is super interesting. But in Sweden, the Erik Gustav Geijer, you know, was, as you were suggesting, much more influenced by France, right, and the French Revolution, and you know, the sort of thinking about citizenship that emerges right from that tradition. And there's a universalist element here too, right? So, and I think this is very important. You know, you laughed before, or you joked before, which I think is very true, that Sweden compares itself to the United States. Now, I would say Sweden and the United States and France, right, are similar in that these are three countries that have these almost crazy universalist, right, and megalomaniac visions of their own societies, right? They quite seriously think, right, and more believably so in the case of France and the United States, that after all are great powers, right, that they are representing models for the rest of the world, right? The Americans have been pretty clear about that, right? The American way, you know, is a recipe for freedom for everybody. And the French have been equally, right, straightforward about this. It's not just about France. These are universal values, right? And the Swedes have been quite similar here, right? They've been promoting, right, a idea that what may in Denmark be known as Danishness, in Sweden, you know, we would de-emphasize Swedishness and rather emphasize the universalism here. And of course, this becomes very quickly quite smug, you know, and sort of overly like imperialistic almost, right, in a sense. But it is an interesting difference, and that means that Sweden, and I think this is to a great discredit to Sweden actually, you know, we do not pay enough attention to those countries that are the most similar to us. Denmark is a case in point, obviously, right? But so is Holland, let's say. You know, a lot of Dutch come to Sweden, interested in Sweden for obvious reasons, you know, high trust country, small country, you know, vibrant market economy, export industry, and so forth and so on. There's so many good reasons why we'd like to talk to each other, learn from each other, right? What do the Swedes do? Completely ignore, you know, all of these countries. And instead, you know, we are just sort of comparing ourselves, just like you said, you know, to the United States, as if that's the natural point of comparison. I mean, there's something a little bit nutty about it, but it has to do with these universalist aspirations. Now, the good news, though, about that is that Sweden is thinking that perhaps more seriously, right, about the sort of broader, even global kind of consequences of thinking about the Swedish or Nordic model. Whereas in Denmark, sometimes, if I may be a little critical, there is a sort of another form of smugness. That is to say that in Denmark, you think that, you know for sure that Denmark is the best country in the world, no question about it. but that is reserved for only Danes, right? So that there is no hope for any other country in the world to become another Denmark. How to get to Denmark, like Francis Fukuyama put it, is not a relevant question in Denmark itself, because you know that is a state that is meant only, it's a destiny that is purely a Danish destiny. And that tends to sometimes shrink, I think, right, the Danish mind, instead of thinking about, well, look, what are we doing? Why does it work so well? Why are we so great? And how can we possibly, right, think about this in terms that are more broad or more universal than purely have a Grundtvigian sort of folkelig perspective on Denmark?
I totally agree. I mean, one of the reasons that I started going so much to Sweden about, what was that, 20 years ago, was because I simply couldn't breathe in Denmark. I mean, I needed that kind of, open looking towards the world, and since I'm not an American, I'll never be an American. I do not speak German. What was the closest place to go was Sweden. And I grew up with Swedish television. I understand Swedish culture very well. So, I mean, it's the other half of me is Swedish, so to speak. And it was literally that sense of, I need to find some people who care about the rest of the world. Where do I go? Oh, Sweden is a good place to go and explore it. And it has been really, for me, literally a door to the rest of the world in a way that doing what I do and writing the books that I do in Denmark has not provided me with. So there is a huge difference. And I also think that there is, so you mentioned Grundtvig, and he's sort of the intellectual father of Denmark and Danishness. And he was born in 1783, and he came up with the idea of the folk high schools, pedagogy, education, and this whole sense of Danishness. And I usually jokingly say, so the Swedish Grundtvig is not Jaeger, but it's actually Alfred Nobel. Because here you have somebody who's an industrialist. He comes up with this really brilliant, but also terrifying invention. And what does he do? He takes the money and donates it for the best science for the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. So it has this outlook, whereas the Danish culture has this sort of, yeah, but we're like cozy here at home and hygge. We're just having a good time and drinking beer and being cozy, and the rest of the world is, the rest of the world, and we don't need to bother. So
I think that's wonderful. I like that. I'm going to remember that the Nobel. We have to slightly dethrone Jaeger and get the Nobel up there, because of course you're right that the Nobel Prize in itself, right, is an expression of this sort of vaguely megalomaniac but also positively universalist and globalist perspective, right? That is to say, he could have put up a prize that was just for Swedes, right? Or like a Grundtvig version would be a prize for
we would have done. For the Swedes, but for the Danes.
Yeah, the prize for the best book about Danishness this year.
We probably have one.
Yeah.
So I have a hypothesis about, but besides the French universalism and the German Herder folkishness ism, there's another reason. And so the Nordic countries used to be at war with each other a lot, and with the rest of, our neighbors. And then Denmark and Sweden have not been at war with each other since 1813. Denmark also went through a bankruptcy at the time, and then we started promoting education more afterwards. We got a folk school, a public school legislation that was actually very ahead of its time in 1814. And that's when we also lost Norway to Sweden. And so we went into this mode of being a small country, a very small country. And then we lost the Schleswig-Holstein duchies to Prussia in 1848, 51, and then in 1864. So we went from being a big country to a very small country. And we had Germany as a neighbor. And we were constantly in fear of either Bismarck or somebody else coming back for the rest of Denmark. And in the whole process of going from a feudal, very poor agricultural society to the modern nation state, Denmark has always had this fear of disappearing. Whereas Sweden has been, surrounded by other small countries. Evil tongues would call it weak countries, but I would call it friendly countries. There hasn't been any neighbors who tried to take Sweden in the whole process of going from being a feudal. I don't even know if you were feudal actually in Sweden, but at least from an
Not in the
agricultural.
same way, no, right.
Right. But so the experience of being Sweden in the world is also radically different from the Norwegian experience, the Finnish experience, and the Danish experience.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing, and this is something which then ties into a question that I think we may talk more about, which is the difference when it comes to nationalism in these countries, right? So Sweden is, along with Denmark, it should be clear, one of the oldest stable territorial states, right, in Europe, right? And I use the word territorial state because it's prior to nationalism, right? So it's not yet, nation states in the sort of modern sense of the word. Sweden is also the first modern tax state during the Great Power period, right, in the 1700s. Sweden establishes is a very, at that time, extremely modern administrative state with a very modern tax system that is also then based, apropos what I said earlier about trust, about a much greater degree of transparency than was the case in the rest of Europe. And that had to do with the lack of feudalism, as you were kind of alluding to, right? Because we had free peasants and they were stingy people. They didn't want to just fork over their cash without knowing what it was going to be used for. So the system created then, was a very efficient one, which was necessary. Sweden was a small country, with a big army, right, out there during the 30 Years' War, fighting the Russians, the Poles, and so forth and so on, and the Danes as well. And it created then one of the earliest stable and pretty modern states. And as you said, that state has not really been under any serious threat. There haven't been a lot of questions about borders either, right? It's not like, there's been a worry about the Finns or the Norwegians or the Danes coming over to take Skåne back or something of that sort, right? Even though some of us in Skåne wouldn't mind, but, still, that has not been a big issue. And so that means we take things for granted. I mean, one thing Swedes do too much, although it's nice in a sense because it creates kind of a laid back, environment, but we take for granted a lot of good things. We take for granted, clean water, peace, high trust, good government, rule of law. All of these things that are, from a global perspective, remarkable, right? And not present. Why do you have confidence in a state? Most countries in the world, right, have governments and states that are destructive, corrupt, dangerous, right, to almost all of the population. So all of this stuff means that Swedes are not very aware, right, of what has created that stability. There's a naivete taken for granted, which I think in Norway, with its experience of having to struggle for its independence, Denmark, with the war experience that you have discussed and the proximity to Germany, that was not always a particularly friendly country. And Finland, of course, that was under Russia for a long time. It means that all of the other countries in the Nordic region have a much more heightened sense, right, that there's something at stake. You can't take it for granted. It's not quite as bad as it is, let's say, in Poland or Ukraine, but there's still a heightened sense, of awareness around these issues, whereas in Sweden, it's almost totally lacking.
Right, and so let's go to the nationalism and the immigration debate. You just had an election in Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
We're recording this on October 14th. We have an election coming up in Denmark on November 1st.
Right.
And we're back to discussing Muslim headscarves. So COVID went away and the war in Ukraine is somewhere else. We'll just focus on the Danish stuff and people in Denmark and the tribe of the Danes. And so the immigration debates and the nationalism in Denmark and Sweden are radically different from one another.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think that, of course, as you know, there has been and a sort of I think unfortunate type of polemic going on now for quite a few years, where Denmark and Sweden are sort of put against each other, right? Swedes look at Denmark as having been too harsh when it comes to immigration and like controlling immigration, being also harsh in terms of integration measures and so forth, right? Whereas the Danes have viewed Swedes as naive about it, right? Not having done what needs to be done, right? So it's been this kind of discussion, and that hasn't been very helpful, right? So again, instead of learning from each other, thinking about Swedes, particularly, I think in this case, learning from the Danes, but the Danes also perhaps learning from the Swedes, right? I usually say that, Sweden has made a lot of mistakes, in the last recent decades when it comes to immigration and integration policies. But what it has gotten right is that migration is here to stay, right? So it's not, you can't stop migration, and you don't want to stop migration, but you want to have intelligent migration policies and integration policies, right? And so Denmark has, as a Norwegian political scientist, sociologist, Grete Brockman, who's done a lot of comparative work, on migration, citizenship issues, in the Nordic and Scandinavian countries in particular, not so much Finland. She usually says that, Sweden is one extreme, Denmark the other extreme, Norway sort of in the middle, right? And but what's in common is we don't tend to learn much from each other, and we need to do that because, in fact, right, you realize now that Sweden is facing all sorts of really terrifically difficult challenges, not just sort of the crime that we see, the violence, the murder rates, gang criminality, but also stuff that is, in a sense, more peaceful kind of problems, right? Unemployment, right? Lack of education, linguistic problems, all of this emanating, right, from a shift in immigration policies where Sweden had a period for a long time, 30, 40 years, where we were way ahead of the other Nordic countries, right? Looking back 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, when we had labor, immigration into Sweden. Now that was very successful. People came here. There were same rules, right, for immigrants and Swedish citizens. Everybody had to work, learn the language, right? That way they became part of society. It was a very straightforward formula, kind of along an Anglo-Saxon model, right? Then that stops after the oil crisis in 1973. And then you see a turn towards instead humanitarian or refugee immigration. In the beginning, it wasn't a big, number, and many of the ones who came with high cultural capital, right? Refugees from Chile, let's say, or many of women coming from Iran. All of them came with, considerable skills and were easily integrated into the labor market. But since we've seen increasingly, right, and exploding in 2015, large-scale immigration, where not everybody, but many, right, come with very poor educational skills, right? Very little human capitals that could be going directly into ensuring that they enter the labor market. They are outside, right? They don't learn to speak Swedish. This is really a huge problem right now. And you can even say, we have 20% of the population foreign-born. And this is now a problem that is so pervasive that it's not clear what solutions will be. But we are starting to look more at Denmark, right? Which Denmark has had not just a tougher policy with respect to who gets in, but also in the areas of crime control, gang criminality, and so forth, right? So we see, how Swedes are starting to look now, after many years of not looking, at Denmark, not just to be critical, but actually try to learn something. The big challenge in Sweden now is not to become sort of overly, right, harsh, right? Lose sight of the positive, aspects of immigration that can, under the right circumstances, right, contributing enormously to Sweden, both economically, but also in terms of culture, social aspects and so forth and so on. So the big challenge right now is, will this new government that's forming today, as you and I speak, actually, right? We're just waiting now to hear what the new government is going to look like, but it's a coalition between four parties to the right, including the Sweden Democrats, right, who is the party that is like the Danish Folkeparti that has been the most critical of immigration. And the risk here is that we're going to enter into a period of sort of uber Danish policies, right? And lose sight, right, of some of the positives of the Swedish positive experience of integration and immigration. And here I think, Swedes and Danes need each other pretty badly, actually, in terms of getting a more reasonable, fact-based, realpolitik approach to immigration and integration, where nationalism, should play a role, but we have to be careful not to delve into some form of, too much of a Grundtvig ethnic nationalism, nor this kind of Swedish globalism, right, where, all forms of nationalism is viewed as bad. Because I think that we have, again, a lot to learn, from the Finns, the Norwegians and Danes, right, in sort of, a positive kind of patriotic view, right, of these national social contracts that have been working so well in so many ways, and that actually are able to, include a reasonable amount of immigrants arriving on terms, right, that are good, not just for the immigrants, but for the society as a whole. So that is how I view the way forward right now, but also some of the dangers.
So one of the things that I sense as you say, I mean, the big difference with immigration in Denmark and Sweden has been that Sweden just opened, from Denmark, it looked as if Sweden just opened its doors without thinking about how do we keep social cohesion in Sweden. I think it was Fredrik Reinfeldt, the prime minister, who said, but we got look, I mean, whenever I fly over Sweden, there's all this forest. I mean, we got room for everybody. And from a Danish perspective, that was like, what? I mean, don't you understand these people need to, function in your society? It's not just a question about room for people. You also need to have, they need to connect with everything that's there. You can't, and by the way, you can't just send people out into the forest. I mean, it's not just, they have to be
that's what they did. I mean, you were spot on here, right? Because what actually happens in 2015, right, is precisely what you're saying. So many people arrive, completely chaotic, right? And then, you just say, well, where are they going to sleep? Where are they going to live, right? And then you discover that there are areas in Sweden, right, which are essentially in a process of depopulation because there are no jobs there, right? But there are lots of empty buildings. So what happens is that then you put the immigrants there, in places, right, where they're guaranteed not to be integrated because there are virtually no people and there's certainly no jobs, right? And then you give money for 2 years to these communes, right, that have no money, right? So they take the money and run. And then 2 years later, they're out of money. There are still no jobs. There is no way to integrate these people, who then start to move, because we also had a rule in Sweden then, right? They took away the old rule that you kind of had to stay where you were sent off. The sort of idea is to distribute immigrants fairly throughout the country. Instead, of course, now we have a rule saying you can go anywhere you want. Now, most people then go to places where there are other immigrants from the country they came from. And you end up creating these communities, often suburban areas of the bigger cities that become crowded. People are living, a lot of people per square meter, and again, poor language skills, very poor connection to the labor market. So the Danish questions, right, that you posed were totally correct. Reinfeldt, and I was sitting with him in his Swedish commission on the Swedish future for a number of years, and I had discussions with him as early as in 2011 to 13 around these issues, right? Because I was studying questions concerning social cohesion and the relationship between trust and diversity, where the relationship is negative unless, right, you have policies in place, right, for including immigrants. And the only way to include people in Swedish society is through work, right? That's true for men and women. So historians will write about this period, with a sense of bewilderment. Like, what were these people thinking about? And I think they were mostly adhering to another aspect of Swedish national identity, which is this idea of Sweden as a humanitarian great power, right, as a moral superpower. Which meant, right, that the only really important thing in Sweden was to show the world that we were do-gooders, right, that we did the right thing morally. These were people fleeing, countries that were in the middle of war, poverty, and so forth, right? So then you don't ask those sorts of questions. You let people in. Now, you can say, morally speaking, right, that's a sort of a Christian thing to do. But the consequences come no matter what. And once you cut the tie between labor market policy and immigration policy, you're going to get problems. And Sweden now has plenty of them.
So when I hear the Swedish debate, and we have all this talk about peoplehood and Danishness in Denmark, and since I don't hear talk about Swedishness in Sweden, but what I do hear is accusations of racism. And I wonder, is there, so in Denmark, we do have the nuances between just embracing people without asking any questions and being actually racist. There's, all kinds of middle positions, and one of them is, how will this work? One of them is, but what will happen to Denmark? And it's not necessarily racism. Do you have that sort of middle field in Swedish, and what is it called?
Well, I think it's a very good question. The difference here, right, between Sweden and Norway and Denmark is that the Sweden Democrats as a political party, right, has been different historically, right? Its historical roots have been different from what you have in both Denmark and Norway. That is to say, there has been a closer tie, between explicitly, right, sort of racist or at least xenophobic kinds of attitudes and values, right? Now, that said, right, the Sweden Democrats today actually, are not really that, explicitly racist, right? They are critical of the immigration policies, and there's a lot of support for that in Sweden. But the other parties, right, have, partly for political reasons, right, adhere to this idea that, you can divide people very easily into two groups. The good people, and then there are the racists, right? And the racists are the people who are the Sweden Democrats and anybody that is supporting them in any form, right? So it's a black-white type of discussion in Sweden. There is no nuance here, right? You either believe in multiculturalism or you are a racist, right? It's a little bit like that. And that's where the Swedish debate then becomes inane, right? It lacks nuance, lacks capacity to kind of see. For example, I have myself argued for many years now, right, that we need to take citizenship more seriously. Swedes are in love with human rights. And I said, citizenship, is central to a social contract of a state. And that's where we have our primary responsibilities, right? Human rights is not a helpful concept here, in fact, because it suggests a connection to the global. Now, of course, we can talk about it in those terms, but not, at the expense, right, of thinking about citizenship. Now, when I've done that, some people will then, no doubt, right, think of me as a suspect, because there is something then about that that's exclusionary. So citizenship and the nation state is then by definition as such, right, and a species, an expression of welfare state, chauvinism, xenophobia, a whiteness regime, right, in the more extreme versions of this argument. And that has become, a legitimate sort of discourse in Sweden, which prevents, I think, a discussion that has a more empirical basis. And I often say it's like this, if you want to, we had a shift in Sweden from a policy of assimilation, that was a rule, well into the 1980s in Sweden, right, to then official multiculturalism, which was then saying essentially that, let's say, Finns that used to come to Sweden and they had to learn to speak Swedish, and they usually learn Swedish within 3 or 4 years. Now they should just speak, Finnish forever, because their culture is very important. They should be able to retain their culture. We started to have homeschool, language, right, home language in schools in Sweden, because it was important for immigrant children to keep their own language. And assimilation became a dirty word. Now, the problem with that, right, is that it is a misunderstanding of what it means to come to a new country, because of course, in relationship to the state, to our laws, to our policies, of course it's assimilation. You can't pick and choose among the laws, which ones you like that fit with your own cultural background. You have to take that package, right? Then in civil society, you can have multiculturalism, right? You can have associations for, everything from, stamp collections to sports to ethnic communities, like you did in the United States, for example. Clubs, you can have your Danish club here in Stockholm, right? Fine, but you can't say we want to have some Danish laws in Sweden. I mean, that doesn't work. So the debate in Sweden has become insane, right? Because you haven't been able to talk about these things in a balanced way, and where the word racist becomes too easily used, and it fails, right? Then it also becomes devoid of real value, because there is real racism, right? And there is issues there that needs to be addressed, of course, but to use it in this kind of a easy way that is being thrown around today, I think actually empties it of meaning ultimately, and people don't take it seriously because they feel like it's used in a frivolous manner for political purposes instead of being serious about it.
There is this sense in Sweden that, as you say, I mean, we're it's universalist. We're the good people, which is sort of an interesting sense of peoplehood. And I've experienced that when I've given lectures or keynotes in Sweden about the Nordic secret and the folk high schools and this whole bildung development in the Nordic countries, and this development in education, and then when I talk about the peoplehood, the sense of Danishness, the sense of Swedishness, I do see the Swedes looking at me as this, racist Dane who talks about what it means to be Danish and Danishness and Grundtvig and all that stuff. And they're kind of above that and beyond that, because we're the Swedes. But then I usually bring in Skåne, Halland, and Blekinge, which used to be Danish, at least Skåne did, and say something like, but in reality, Skåne is Danish, and I can just tell that something shifts in their eyes. It's like, she said what?
Well, there's a Danish historian, maybe you know him, Uffe Østergaard. And Uffe and I used to be part of the same sort of network of Nordic historians, back, maybe a couple of decades ago. And he was a funny guy, in this sort of Danish way. And then he always liked to stir up the discussions by saying that, Skåne, that's the Kosovo of Denmark. Right, and this was during the Yugoslav civil war period.
Right.
Yeah, but his point was, of course, once you think about it, right, you realize, I understand what he means, because the first Danish university was Lund University, right? This is Skåne is not just some sort of like a distant, faraway province of Denmark. Right, this was part of the Danish heartland, right?
Exactly. So residential city of, yeah.
Yeah, Copenhagen is located much closer to Skåne than it is to anything on Jylland, right? And so Skåne was not just some kind of distant, like Norrland version of Denmark, right? This was at the very, very center. So of course there is something to his joke. Now, of course, at the same time, there has never been formulated in Denmark, as far as I know, that type of resentful form of nationalism that we're forever living in the shadow of the loss of Skåne and so forth. So that is something that, to Grundtvig's great credit, right, he was not engaging, right, in that sort of politics of resentment. His tack, and this is the beauty with the folk building tradition, is that it said it accepted little Denmark, if you will, right, and decided to make the best possible out of that. And that, of course, has not happened in Serbia, right, where the is critical. But Skåne still to answer your question, I think that there are elements here, right? When we see, you know, where certain types of Danish kind of conversations around immigration are more possible. I actually find that if I'm in Skåne, where I spend a lot of my time when I'm not in Stockholm, I can have a very different type of conversation about these issues, about both nationalism, immigration, integration, than I can have here in Stockholm. So I do think that there are regional differences here. Sweden Democrats as a political party also grew first, you know, in Skåne, right? You know, and that's where it still has its strongholds, for better or worse, right? So there are regional differences, although we are seeing now, right, the Sweden Democrats are steadily gaining strength throughout Sweden, right? So you don't want to overplay that regional difference either.
Right. I mean, the Grundtvig nationalism is about language and shared cultural norms and values, and so once Skåne is, and I mean, when was that, like 1648 or something? So, I mean, it's also interesting that like 400 years later, we're still like, oh, Skåne used to be part of Denmark. It's like,
yeah. Well, you have a Skåne flag, right? You have you have seen the Skåne flag, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's red with yellow. Yeah, exactly. And so it does show something, say something about how deep these, the sense of peoplehood and where do I belong, how deep that goes into the sense of being human. And so the great thing about Grundtvig's nationalism is that since they now you do speak Swedish in Skåne and you identify as Swedes, it's like, we don't want you. I mean, stay Swedish. Because why would we want to have a Swedish-speaking population in Denmark that didn't identify as Danes? And that is actually how we decided the border between Denmark and Germany in 1920 in Denmark. After the First World War, we got the offer of getting back the two duchies that were taken by Bismarck in 1864. And the Danish attitude was, we don't want a lot of people inside our borders who do not identify as Danes, because that's just going to be a source of more conflict and border conflicts. And so there was a referendum, and the border was drawn according to where's the majority of the Danishness and the Germanness in the area. And there's a German minority on the northern side of the border and a Danish minority on the southern side of the border. And it's actually becoming a very interesting border area where the Danish minority has, I think, a number of 1 or 2 seats in the local Bundestag in Schleswig. Or it's just that they're so popular that the Danish party gets voted in all the time. I even think they have a German mayor, a Danish mayor in Flensborg or something like that. I should have checked my sources before I started talking about this on video. But the Danish minority in northern Germany actually plays a cultural role in that area. And for some reason, we don't hear a lot in Denmark from the German minority in the southern part of Denmark and the Danish side of the border. But it really is interesting that the sense of, so in order to be a people and have social cohesion and trust in authorities and all these things and in each other, we just chose to have a smaller country and not go for the expansion and deal with all this.
No, that's right. No, I think that I can see that. And I think that, you know, in Sweden, a version of that, which is a more the Swedish version, is the centrality in Sweden of rule of law and of citizenship, right? You saw that also if you look at this 1920s period, and the question that arose when Finland gained its independence from Russia, right? Then you had this island of Åland, right? You know, that's closer to Sweden actually, and is Swedish speaking. And there, you know, it's all of the opposite of the Danish reaction, right? Because if we had been more like the Danes, we would have probably said, you know, these people speak Swedish and they actually would like to be part of Sweden, so we should make an effort about that, right? But Swedes were not so preoccupied then, right, with Swedishness, right? So for them, it was more important, right, not to create a conflict with Finland over this issue, right? But rather than agree, you know, with a sort of a demilitarized Åland that was, you know, not a problem in any way, with, you know, lots of fluidity, so you can go back and forth, and, you know, the Swedish language would, you know, still be available there and so forth. So it was a different kind of solution. But I think what's common here, right? What's common here when we look at the connections between the sort of the Grundtvigian and the Jaeger traditions is that there's a respect, I think, ultimately, for rule of law, democracy, versus, right, you know, some sort of lust for military solutions, right, to problems. And so that's, I think, you know, is something I think that is valuable here in these traditions, whether this coming, right, more from the kind of Danishness or the Swedishness perspective, right, because they both in a way land in a fairly decent kind of place of solving these problems. And, you know, one could imagine today, right, if in Ukraine and Russia, if they would have been able to take a step back a long time ago, right, and say, look, why don't we have the Danes organize, right, you know, international, you know, elections here in this area, so actually find out what do actually the citizens think about this, you know, and that is what you did, you know, in the case of Schleswig-Holstein, right, which was a kind of a remarkable and rare example of having those kinds of votes at a time when those borders had to be drawn. Right? So it's an interesting moment, and it's a similar thing when you look at the way the Swedes did not get into any kind of warlike scenarios over Åland, you know.
So just, I mean, in Ukraine, they actually have had a couple of referendums, and there was one in 2012, and I forgot if that was the latest one, but the latest one definitely showed a majority identifying as Ukrainian and wanting to be part of Ukraine rather than Russia in all the regions in Ukraine. So, but of course, if Russia does not recognize that, then you have a problem.
Well, it has to be a two-way thing, of course, for it to work. Yeah.
So I would like to, because we're about to conclude, but I do want to return to the question of whether the Swede is human, and you gave it a different title in English, which is about Swedish love.
Yeah.
So I wonder, are the Danes human? Are the Swedes human? Are the Scandinavians, the Nordic people, are we human? And what do you actually mean by this? Because it's, you mentioned the sort of the socialism, and from an American point of view, we're all, a lot of people refer to the Nordic countries as socialism, but that's not really the case. It's something else. And if you could just summarize what is it that you actually mean by this? What is it that's going on?
Very reasonable question, you know, and if the title in the Swedish original was meant as a provocation, but it was taken from a very bitter Swedish journalist who wrote a book with that title in 1946. And what it had to do with was a kind of a meditation on the Swedish national character. And this journalist, Sanford Nilsson was his name. He loved Italy. And what he really loved, you know, was his sort of romantic vision of family and the love of, you know, children and the kind of more traditional type of family with the mother and the father and so forth. And he found Swedes to be that sort of cold-hearted. They were too preoccupied with individual freedom. That was his main quarrel. And this was a long sort of litany of stories and books written about Swedish national character that we go through in this book, starting, you know, in the late 19th century, then well into the 1940s in Sweden, which emphasized that Swedes were, you know, preferred, right, you know, their individual freedom and solitude, nature. They preferred nature over human contact, right? They view, to paraphrase Jean-Paul Sartre, you know, that, you know, hell is other people, right? You know, and the less, you know, you have to deal with other people, the more happy you will be, right? Now, I mean, exaggerating here, of course, right? And what we then do in this book is sort of, we take that as a sort of point of departure, and we formulate these two kind of concepts that are central. One is statist individualism, which is about this, alliance between the state and the individual that is central to the Swedish social contract, that has then liberated many, as particularly those in unequal power relationships, like women in their family, the elderly, their children, and so forth, right, from relations of dependency and unequal power relations in these intimate kinds of subnational forms of communities, and using the state, right, and modern social policy, family policy, to emancipate and to give individual freedom, not just to a privileged group of men, but to all members of society. Then, given that all of this happens in Sweden, right, starting in, let's say, 1940s, accelerating 1960s and 70s, during a period of democracy, we also have to understand that this was not something that was, kind of pushed on Swedes from above by trigger-happy social engineers. This was chosen freely by Swedish citizens. So what's in it for the citizen is our next question. And that's where the Swedish theory of love comes into the picture. And our point with that is that what the Swedish theory of love is about is that Swedes tend to prefer, right, to have also their more intimate relations in family, among friends, and so forth, based on voluntariness, equality, right, and autonomy, rather than duties, right? So that means that there's something about the social contract in this modern sense that speaks to those desires. Today, if you ask, for example, Swedish elderly, what do you prefer in your old age? To be dependent on your own adorable children, or on collective welfare institutions? They will say, we prefer to be dependent on the welfare institutions. Now that sounds, for many people around the world, like a crazy idea, right? Because why would you not prefer to be taken care of by your own adult children? So I usually joke and say there's a couple of different ways of understanding this. One is perhaps they simply know their own children too well, but it's a little mean-spirited of me, because if you ask another question, which we do, would you like your children to visit you? Almost everybody says yes. So the point is that the Swedes, it's not that they are so asocial, that maybe they are not quite, as social as the Danes, but, it's more about these principles, right? That you like to see your children as an elderly person, but not cap in hand, right? To depend on them. You want to be able to have your own freedom as long as you can, your own autonomy, right, as an individual. And that is the heart of the Swedish theory of love. Now, from this perspective, of course, Swedes are human. We start our book with taking a little passage from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who talks about how it's the fate of humanity to be stuck, between two powerful forces. One, right, is this lust for individual sovereignty and freedom. The other one is the absolute necessity to be part of a society, because we cannot survive on our own. So each society in the world has to face that challenge. How do you create a social contract that both provides cohesion, in society, and maximizes the space for individual freedom? And our point of contention here is essentially that the Nordic countries have been particularly good at finding that type of solution. And it is, in that sense, not just a Swedish thing. There's a lot of similarities here. One author from Finland, actually inspired by our book, wrote a book in English, and there she talks about the Nordic theory of love. So she has sort of taken our idea and tried to broaden it out, right? And that goes back to our earlier discussion about commonality versus difference within the Nordic region. And there are differences. I think that Swedes are extreme, in their statist individualism and their version of the Swedish theory of love. But in a global perspective, there is much, much more that unites Sweden with Norway, Finland, and Denmark than, what, goes on in the rest of the world, right? So you can speak about it both as a sort of a particular extreme Swedish form, but as part of a broader subset of the Nordic.
So when I read the book, very early on in the book, it felt like, so it's like a whole country of Pippi Longstockings.
Yes.
Yeah. So there she is, she's all alone in a big house, money in a box, and she's not lacking any material goods. She has two friends, but the relationship is not that close. And I don't know if they represent the Danes, by the way. But anyway, there is this almost a haunting TV episode of the Pippi Longstocking television series from the 70s, and I grew up with watching that. There's a Christmas episode where Pippi is all alone on Christmas Eve, and,
Right.
and it's actually one of the saddest moments in television that you can watch, because she realizes that you can't just be all alone with a horse and a little monkey and be happy. You need to have other people around you. And I do think that eventually she does celebrate Christmas with Tommy and Annika. But I hope, that's my childhood memory. I think she does. I hope she did. But there is this lack of intimacy, and I think that is the non-human part of it. But I also do, and having grown up in Denmark and knowing this welfare system from the inside, you're absolutely right, because the social relationships in the Nordics are really there because we want them to be there. We're not economically dependent on our parents. I mean, until you're 18, you are, or your uncle, and you don't have to. I mean, if you lose your job or anything, there's a system that can take care of you, and you don't have to love it, and they don't have to love you, and you don't have to see them for dinner at any time, because having a social security net under you is defined by law, and that gives a lot of freedom. And whenever people talk about freedom around the world, and particularly in the United States, it is very much this rugged individualism that actually ties you up in a lot of other relationships that do not make you free.
Exactly. This is exactly how this book started, right? Because I arrived in the United States. I was in Southern California. I was at Pomona College there, and I was talking to their financial aid office. And I was trying to understand exactly how I was going to finance this adventure, right? And my question was a very simple one. Assume that I'm accepted on academic merits, then what happens on the financial end of things? And then they explained to me that there was something called financial aid. And I said, I like that idea very much. How do I get it? And they gave me these forms, right? And there was one set of forms about my own economy, my income, my wealth, right? Easy, zeros and a signature. And then the other one was about my parents. And so I said, I don't understand. I said, what do they have to do with this? I said, I'm an adult now, right? So I don't have any financial relations. And so they explained to me slowly, like I didn't quite understand. In America, parents have an ongoing, responsibility, based on, the family and the love and all of these things, right? And so I said, well, that's really wonderful. I said that they are so generous, but I said, isn't there a power problem here? I said, what if a parent says to a child that if you study something useful, right, like economics, or you become a doctor, or lawyer or something like that, we'll be happy to provide you with some cash. But if you do something utterly useless, right? So let's say studying medieval poetry or something like that, guaranteed never to get a job in your entire life, right? When they say no, isn't that a way of using, inappropriate power to limit my autonomy as an adult individual? So, and they looked at me like I was from Mars, right? And I immediately realized no longer, this discussion was not relevant. Fortunately, my parents were just as poor as I was, so it didn't really have any impact, but it made me think, about exactly what you said, this sort of, individualism in America is not really about really universal individualism. It's about a fear of a state. Right? It's anti-statism posing as individualism, right? Because in reality, it's all about limiting the power of the state and then submitting a lot of individuals, to other kinds of unequal power relationships, right? In charities, in families and so forth, right? Churches, etc. So I think this is exactly what you're talking about. And here I think we have more in common, right? And finally, there is a lot of talk about solitude, right? Loneliness, right? With respect to Sweden in particular, but throughout, the assumption is that somehow people in Southern Europe, happier, and then they because they are so close, and there's all families and all these things. There's no empirical evidence, to support that. Everything we see, and there's been a lot of studies done on that, right? And if you take the elderly in particular, right, the most vulnerable, they are, much happier here than they are, in Southern or Eastern Europe. And it seems to be because of exactly what we talked about, because they are not stuck, right, in relationships that they have not chosen to be in, right? Whereas the Nordic, elderly are still able, right, to, control, right, their own social life as they please. And I think that is hugely important, right? Now, given that, of course, if you live long enough, you will be lonely, right? Because your friends eventually die, and you can't replace old friends when you're 85 years old with someone new. So of course there are lonely people in Sweden too, but it's not like comparatively that is any way sort of something that characterizes the Nordic countries.
Right. So maybe we did actually create the Achievable Utopia, or at least we got very close in the Nordics. I would like to thank you for this conversation. It's been really interesting, and I really enjoyed reading the book, and I'm very happy to hear that it will be out in English. I think it has inspired me a lot, and I think that there's a lot to learn from the book about what is actually freedom and what is the good life. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lene. Thank you very much.